So, what's so good about coffee?
Coffee is absolutely delicious. It's my favorite thing. It tastes better than anything else in my life right now. So yeah, that's coffee. What do you mean? What do you mean on the health side?
Oh, whatever that question means to you.
So
Go on,
go on,
Alex.
Alex. Yeah. So it's a big question. Ultimately, I guess there is the silly side of it, which is, I think, like Alex, for me, it's part of like my morning routine, but in quite like a mindful way. Like, it's for a lot of people, I think, isn't it? The coffee in the morning, it's the moments themselves, it gets them connected, it's kind of starts that process. And I often speak to clients about trying to initiate it as a mindfulness exercise. So I once got taught this amazing gratitude practice of, when you're drinking your coffee, think about everything from the person who grew the coffee beans to the person packaging the coffee beans to the people who transported the coffee beans. And it becomes a really spiritual practice ultimately. So you've got that side of coffee, you've got the social and the cultural side of coffee, people coming together once lockdown is over, obviously, and having that bonding and people catching up, and yeah, I guess that social side. And then you've got the health side, which is, how long do we have? Ultimately, there's an increasing amount of research showing us that it doesn't have to be this guilty pleasure that we limit in our day, depending on obviously some of the context and the independent reactions that sometimes people have, insomnia and anxiety and the jitteriness often people ask about. But we're seeing research showing us that coffee has health benefits from a guts perspective, from a neurological perspective, a cancer perspective, a liver perspective, a kidney perspective, obviously an athletic perspective. And we could probably go on if we started thinking about it more. So, obviously, I'm not sure if there are any specific areas you want to kind of dive into today, but the world is our oyster in regards to why coffee is great.
Why don't we start talking?
That's why I brought you along, Alex.
No, I've got a question, because I'm in total agreement for that, and I probably have a very strong bias towards coffee too, because I do love it as well. But when I was also trying to look at the research with regards to the health promoting benefits, and just like a lot of research in nutrition, a lot of it is correlation, right? And a lot of it, it's very, very hard to find sort of that causative effect. So how does coffee and caffeine stack up independently of just living a healthy lifestyle in general? Like, if you were to take someone who's completely unhealthy, really poor diet, really low activity levels, overweight, not sleeping, would coffee, or would the introduction of coffee have a health promoting benefit in that certain situation?
Mm-hmm. I guess that's in some ways the $1 million question, isn't it? So like you say, it's the challenge with any field of, or any element of nutrition, trying to compartmentalize one thing when we know how interconnected everything in our lifestyle and bodies are. So I guess the way that I would initially start to approach that, and Alex obviously dive in here as well, is there's been for a long time the epidemiological research. So the observational research, basically, that you go and look at some studies, 500,000 people, 900,000 people. They try and eliminate some of the confounders, so the smoking, sedentary lifestyles and things, and they see these correlations between coffee consumption and some of the conditions that we just listed.
Yeah.
What we're now seeing is we're getting, obviously, year by year, more clinical studies showing us more of a direct causation between some of these things. And then we've got a huge amount and an ever increasing amount of preclinical studies where we're looking at, obviously, in vitro, in vivo, kind of laboratory studies that are looking at specific mechanisms to try and then, I guess, connect the dots. How does what we see observationally at a global scale break down into some of these cellular pathways or mechanisms that we can evaluate independently on cell cultures and stuff like this? And I guess, we're seeing that correlation. So we're starting to see mechanistically how are some of these compounds in coffee influencing specific pathways, organs, etc. But I think, Ivan, you'll know this through kind of your own research. I think once you've seen enough research in a specific area, you get a sense of where things are at ultimately. And you can see that confidently, based on everything that's out there at the moment, we do have an increasing amount of evidence that these correlations are to some degree also causations, so to speak. But it is, that's kind of where we're at. We're in this point, I think, where we're starting to see the more mechanistic understanding of coffee and its compounds like chlorogenic acids or terpenes, etc. But it's a really good question. It is something that, you know, we're excited to see develop in the research, but it's getting there, definitely.
So I think the early research was all kind of epidemiological and observational studies. That was in 2017, the British Medical Journal published an umbrella review, which looked at 218 meta-analyses of observational studies and some randomized controlled trials. And they concluded, in their words, that coffee was good for just about everything. And their headline was, in one of the articles, was that scientists wake up to the benefits of coffee. But they did call for the need, they did suggest the need for more kind of the mechanistic studies. So it's really since 2017 that they've ramped up in number.
That's cool. So I guess my next question would be, could someone still live an extremely healthy life without any coffee whatsoever? I know that sounds like a bleak future, and I definitely would not want that for anyone. But if we were to think theoretically, if someone was to eliminate caffeine altogether and implement all those other healthy practices that we just spoke about, would they miss out on any benefits? Would they miss out on any additional health promoting effects from coffee just on its own?
I think Alex would be a better place to answer this, but there's one thing I'll say before handing over to Alex, is that most people don't realize about coffee is that coffee is the richest source of antioxidants in our diet. And there's a study in a Norwegian study in 2004 that showed that for coffee drinkers, coffee contributes 66% on average of your total dietary intake of antioxidants. And
that's because they're not eating fruits and vegetables, though.
We've got the swapping coffee for fruits and vegetables. I mean, good theory, but it was backed up in different studies around the world. So some are in Japan, Poland, Norway. So, you know, but yeah, then you go back to the confounding variables and the association coffee drinkers with kind of traditionally had with the unhealthy lifestyles of not eating fruits and vegetables, but hopefully these days. But anyway, yeah, so if you don't drink coffee, you are missing out on that huge antioxidant potential of coffee. But I mean, you know, you can get that from plenty of other places as well. Over to Alex.
Yeah, I mean, it's an impossible question in some ways to obviously fully answer, because, okay, what comes to mind? Well, from a behavioral perspective, are we realistically going to be able to get some of the population increasing their fruit and veg intake to replace some of the antioxidants missing from their coffee? Probably not. So in those situations, they will not be living as healthier life because they're not replacing it. And that's like, that could be a behavioral type thing. So, and I'm putting my hand up here, I'm obviously biased. But
so we. I love coffee too. I also want to be I also want to play devil's advocate. Just to
it's good. It's good.
Up.
It is interesting. It gets my brain kicking into gear. But the other thing is, caffeine independently has health benefits, especially in regards to some of the neurological factors. And what some studies have shown is that the caffeine in non-coffee beverages does not have that same health benefit. Therefore, it is the coffee compounds independent of the caffeine that are providing some of these antioxidant properties and the benefits that come with it. So there are all sorts of different factors in that. I think, I don't know if it's MS or Parkinson's disease, but certainly caffeine is one of the main things that reduces the risk there. But as we say, there are other studies that have found that actually non-caffeine compounds of coffee are improving the health benefits as well. So that's another way of looking at it. And also the last point that comes to mind, I guess, is one of the best sources of chlorogenic acid is coffee. If you compare it to sweet potatoes, Jerusalem artichokes, and some of the other things that are relatively good sources of chlorogenic acid. So to try and replace that is you know, for some people going to be quite challenging ultimately when you're thinking that the sweet spot for coffee consumption is 3 to 5 mugs a day. So it'd be interesting to do the maths and be like, okay, well, how much chlorogenic acid is that? And how much sweet potato would you have to eat to replace that kind of thing?
Alex, just for the listener's sake, can you explain what chlorogenic acid is?
Yeah, so chlorogenic acid is really, it's a plant-based compound. It's a polyphenol. It's found in a lot of plant-based foods, but coffee is one of the best sources of it. And it's got a lot of the research that's been done on coffee can be applied to chlorogenic acids. So it's found in other foods, like we listed sweet potato, Jerusalem artichoke. It's in some, I think, Chinese herbs and things like this as well at some level. But it's been associated with a lot of the health benefits of coffee. So it's been associated with the reduction in type 2 diabetes. It's been associated with a reduction in certain cancers. It has very potent antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties, hence the reduced risk of some of these conditions. So ultimately, yeah, it's a polyphenol, a plant-based compound that's found in coffee, and obviously exhale coffee beans have been specifically chosen for the amount of chlorogenic acid that it has in it.
Understood. You said at the beginning, so when we asked you the $1 million question, what's so good about coffee, you had a couple of different reasons. You had the mindfulness, spiritual aspect, you had the health and the body aspect, and then you had the brain aspect. Can you touch a little bit more about the impact on the brain and the potentially cognitive benefits that come from coffee and why that happens?
So yeah, I guess from a cognitive perspective, you've got the well-known one of improved attention, alertness, and like the immediate cognitive enhancement that comes from coffee, which we thought was primarily based on the caffeine, obviously. And what's happening is we're having an impact on the adenosine receptor. So as we go through our day, adenosine is accumulating, it's contributing to our desire to sleep, put very simply, and coffee or caffeine is inhibiting that adenosine receptor, and therefore produces more of an alert wakefulness state, which we can obviously all thrive from in regards to productivity and getting stuff done. However, in regards to more of the neurological element of this and brain health, when we think about Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, a meta-analysis has shown that I think it was on average 3 mugs of coffee per day had a 25% reduced risk of developing Parkinson's disease. And there are various reasons for that. So if you take a step back and you think that what we know about a lot of these chronic conditions is inflammation is one of the primary drivers of a lot of these conditions. We've already mentioned that coffee, partly because of the chlorogenic acid, but also because of a lot of the other compounds in coffee, has an anti-inflammatory benefit. So if we're incorporating more of these anti-inflammatory compounds into the diet, we're having a positive impact on a big driver of things like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, MS, and a lot of these other conditions. In regards to what we know happens, so chlorogenic acid, and I actually think maybe caffeine as well, from memory, they have a neuroprotective effect on the dopamine receptors. So now you're really challenging my brain. In Parkinson's disease, one of the mechanisms that's going on is there is a deterioration in dopamine transduction. So dopamine, a neurotransmitter, when there is degeneration within that sort of pathway, that's one of the mechanisms involved in Parkinson's disease, basically. Hence, the medication L-DOPA is about replacing and supporting dopamine and dopamine transmission. So what coffee seems to do, and this is done on the preclinical studies, is it essentially improves and supports and protects those dopamine neurons. So it's having that impact on it, hence the reduced risk of developing Parkinson's disease. But there's also another receptor, and the name is escaping me, but there's another mechanism that we're learning about that we think coffee is influencing, basically. Apologies, I can't remember the exact receptor at the moment. It might come to me. But yeah, it's a fascinating area because obviously, you know, the rise of neurodegenerative conditions is really scary when you look at the stats, especially with things like dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And coffee seems to have a significant role to play within reducing this risk. And that's largely driven from an antioxidative and anti-inflammatory perspective. But going back to the very beginning of this conversation, we know that loneliness is an inflammatory experience. And there is a huge social side to coffee as well. So that's probably, going back to Ivan's question around all these different variables, that's probably coming into it as well to some degree, because when we're doing the research epidemiologically and observational, a key thing to consider is when they're not choosing like healthy coffee, they're often using bog standard coffee and still seeing those sorts of health benefits. So then if you're choosing coffee that has been selected because of its chlorogenic acid and things like this, then obviously you're increasing that further ultimately. So there are lots of different potential mechanisms, some that are being researched and some that just make sense in regards to like the social side of things.
Real quick, with regards to the alertness and productivity side of things, I agree. I think all those things are valid. But when you do look at the research as well, a lot of those studies are done on people who are habitual caffeine intakers, or they habitually drink coffee. And I'm sure you would know this as well, as you increase your caffeine intake over years and months, you develop more adenosine receptors, right? Because the brain, because if you got caffeine if you got caffeine latching onto those receptors, and then you got adenosine just floating around the brain will start to make more receptors as just like a result over the long term. So and this is where people sort of get a crash, where the caffeine sort of precipitates and then they get hit with all this adenosine just flooding their brain. So would you then say that the performance benefits that people do see are because chronic use sort of lowers your general mood and alertness overall, and then coffee sort of just perks it up back to normal, where it would be if you didn't have any caffeine or coffee?
Good question. So I think it depends on the amount of coffee someone is consuming, obviously, to begin with. So they have done some studies on this in athletes, looking at things like with caffeine withdrawal for a few days before the event, to then try and improve kind of the performance enhancing capacity of it. And from memory, Alex, I'm not sure if you have a better memory on this area of things for me, but from memory, they've generally shown that it's not needed. So regular coffee drinkers can still have that kind of 3 to 6 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of body weight, I think it is, and get the performance enhancement benefit without having to do any kind of withdrawal of coffee before their race or event or competition. So I think unless someone's having excessive amounts on a daily basis where maybe that sort of situation is occurring, we don't have to worry about that element of things. That's my initial thought. Alex, I'm not sure if you've got anything to add on that. Oh, yeah. Have you gone on mute?
It's coffee.
I would say you would probably be best kind of weighing up the some of the benefits that you could potentially gain from the coffee versus the kind of some of the negatives. And it seems that kind of long-term habitual use of coffee is much more often associated with some huge reductions in risk of diseases, which Alex mentioned already.
And then obviously you just got good quality decaf that can always come into this mix as well. So we don't have to be drinking 5 mugs of caffeine a day, because, I think one of the things that we do need to raise is so many people are living such stressful lifestyles, especially in the last year, that the idea that for a lot of people consuming that sweet spot of 3 to 5 mugs of coffee a day, all of which are caffeinated, does come with concerns if people are already in a very stressed state, maybe not getting enough sleep and things like this. So, personally, I'll have my caffeinated coffee in the morning because I like a little bit of a lift and I prefer it. And then I might go on to decaf so I can get to that kind of sweet spot, basically. And you're still getting all of those non-caffeine benefits. So that's obviously one way to go about it as well.
Yeah, that's what I do. It's definitely what I do.
You said earlier that these research studies are just using bog standard coffee as opposed to better quality coffee. What makes a good coffee versus a bad coffee, and how does the layman know the differences between what they're drinking?
Might be one for Alex.
It's impossible for the layman to know what makes a good versus a bad one. Ultimately, there's a whole lot of different compounds which we talked about, which could give potential health benefits in coffee, such as the chlorogenic acid, the polyphenols, and a whole lot of others like diterpenes, cafestol, calweol, trigonylene. There's a load of different compounds that the studies cite most often as being potentially given the health benefits. And then there's a lot of things that could potentially have negative health impacts in coffee, such as the mycotoxins and pesticides, heavy metals and things. So we kind of prefer to focus on the potentially healthier compounds in coffee, although we do tick the box of all of the negatives. So we do test for all the mycotoxins, pesticides to make sure it's free from all of those. We kind of prefer to focus on the positives because there's a whole lot of positives behind coffee as well. And as far as the most cited chemical, the most studied one, chlorogenic acid, there's studies which show it is hugely variable in the coffees that you drink. So if you go to a cafe, there's a study which was in 2014, and they tested 104 espressos from cafes in Scotland, Italy, and Spain. And they showed a 31-fold difference between the chlorogenic acid content in the most concentrated versus the lowest concentrated. So 31 times more chlorogenic acid in one than the other. So you have no idea what you're drinking, basically. So it's impossible to tell, which is why we went through our whole process, which I can go into if you'd like. But yeah, to find a coffee that is much higher in chlorogenic acid than any other.
So when you're going on the local high street and you've got all these different independent shops, the chains, and all the different options you have, you don't really know. Outside of taste, there's no real knowledge of differentiation.
So you can get some indications. So a lighter roast, so a coffee starts off in its green state with its highest concentration of chlorogenic acid in it. And as you roast the coffee, the chlorogenic acid slowly drops. And then as you get much beyond a medium roast coffee, it kind of drops off a cliff somewhere. So if you, and when you get to a dark roast coffee, it can drop to about 10% of its original concentration. So if you go for a more medium roast kind of coffee or light to medium roast coffee, you know that you're going to be getting more than a dark roast coffee, for example. So there's a few indicators like that. There's a few other things around like the cafestol and calweol in coffee, which are associated to the fatty acids, and the darker you roast them. If you look at a coffee bean, when you see the oils on the outside, so you only get those with a darker roast coffee, for example, and those oils contain the cafestol and calweol. So as you roast it darker, the oils start to leave the bean, taking with it the cafestol and calweol. So if you go for a more medium roast or lighter roasted coffee without oil on the surface, it's a good indication that it's retained much more of its kind of original concentration of cafestol and calweol. So there's a few indicators like that, but in general, you have no real idea.
Well, that's the big problem.
Scary.
And speaking from like shop to shop, what about country to country? How does that impact? Because you always hear like Colombian beans, Brazil beans, Indian beans, and like you just when I look at the thing, I just go for the most exotic combination. I don't know about you guys.
Me too.
There's a lot of different things going on there. So there's different varieties of beans. So there's Robusta beans, which are more likely to grow at the kind of lower altitudes in Brazil. And they're more pest resistant, they're higher in caffeine, they don't taste as good. So that's another way of telling. If you go to a cafe and they use a Robusta blend, so Robusta versus Arabica, Robusta beans generally have a higher concentration of chlorogenic acid, but they also, most people don't really like the taste of them. So you struggle to find anyone selling a single origin Robusta bean. When you're talking about the rest of the rest of Arabica coffee, there is some studies which seem to show that higher altitude grown Arabicas have higher concentrations of chlorogenic acid, but ultimately all countries, you could find a high concentration chlorogenic acid in a coffee from any different country. And when we went through our process, we got 41 different coffees from all corners of the globe, and there is no real correlation between which country had the higher levels of chlorogenic acid.
So it's just, you're just picking it at random then, really, but when
Yeah.
it comes to countries.
So there's different processing methods as well, which lend themselves to a higher concentration. So
Okay.
Coffee all starts its life as inside a cherry. So coffee isn't actually a bean; it's a seed which grows inside a cherry on a tree, and those cherries are picked, and then to get the coffee seed out of the cherry, they're fermented, and there's a few different ways of doing that. So they call them washed versus natural. You might have seen on the front of coffee packets. And there's certain processing methods which lend themselves to leave more of the chlorogenic acid in the coffee. So, for example, the natural method means that the coffee is left out to dry in the sun after it's fermented for a lot longer, and the UV rays of the sun can degrade the chlorogenic acid faster. So generally, a natural processed coffee will have a lower concentration of chlorogenic acid in it. So there's a few telltale signs like that, but still, it's really difficult to tell.
Yeah, and just on that same note, like, what about notes? You know, so on the packets, you also get like this has a bit of dark chocolate, salted caramel. What are they doing to create these notes, and how do they actually form?
The notes are just all unique notes so there's over 900 different flavonoids in coffee which contribute to the flavor. So there's a different combination of those 900 different chemicals and compounds in coffee, and that's unique combination of those contributes to its individual flavor. So they say no two coffees grown anywhere in the world will have the same flavor profile, because they'll all have very, very different combinations of these compounds in them. And even crop to crop, year to year, you can have the same plantation grown in exactly the same field, but because of different weather and different climatic kind of variabilities from one year to the next, the different combinations of those compounds can lead to different flavor tasting notes in the coffee. So it's just it's totally down to the environmental conditions that the coffee is grown in, and it's totally unique to each coffee and each bean.
Interesting. And then the only one out, you got the countries, the notes, and then there's the processing way. So, for example, I use an AeroPress. I buy full coffee beans, and then I grind them, and then I use an AeroPress. What are the different methodologies, and what should, like, someone, if you're a coffee enthusiast listening to this, what should they be doing to maximize the experience every morning?
So if you're talking about experience from a health perspective, which I presume you are,
I just want the biggest dose of caffeine.
Yeah.
So from the health perspective, there are lots of different studies which some say certain different brewing methods are healthier than others, but ultimately the kind of most consistent research that I've read seems to be around kind of taking the brewing back to imagining it as a chemical reaction. So just like any chemical reaction, higher temperatures will generally speed up a chemical reaction. So brewing methods that use a higher temperature, such as a cafetiere, are more likely to extract the healthy compounds from the coffee beans. And there's other types of brewing methods, like they call it the cowboy method or the Turkish method, where they boil it. So if you can handle the taste of some of those, then they are generally the most efficient at extracting the polyphenols and chlorogenic acid from the coffee. Then the other thing to consider is the grind size of the coffee. So while the temperature works in the favor of cafetieres, actually the grind size probably works against it, because just like any chemical reaction, again, the greater the surface area, the more the faster a chemical reaction happens. So with anything, and because of that, leaning towards brew methods that use a finer grind size would speed up the extraction of the polyphenols and chlorogenic acid and lead to a healthier cup. So cafetiere, for example, again, generally you recommend a coarse grind size for it. So if you want to tweak your own brew method, if you're using a cafetiere, use a slightly finer grind size than you would normally, and you're more likely to extract more of the polyphenols and chlorogenic acid. And same with your AeroPress. If you use a slightly hotter temperature in your AeroPress and a slightly finer grind size, you're probably going to make it healthier.
Okay, and what about taste then? How does that change?
Well, then because of doing that, so then it's a really fine balance between the taste and the health effects of the coffee. Because if you then go for a finer grind size and a hotter temperature, you're more likely to over extract the coffee, the flavor compounds of coffee, and get more of the bitter flavors coming through. So it's a fine balance between pushing the health benefits and not over extracting some of the more negative flavors. So it depends kind of what you're going for in your coffee.
I've got an AeroPress too.
Have you got an
so
AeroPress?
Convenient. Yeah, it's so convenient.
Yeah.
I've had like other machines that just break and just annoying. Got to clean them, all that nonsense.
AeroPress is great and it's really good to travel with, but there's one tip I would give on the AeroPress, and it's on the paper filter. So two of the healthiest compounds, the cafestol and carriol are mentioned, are part of they're associated with the fatty acids in coffee. And if you use a paper filter, it'll filter out around 98% of the fatty acids and the oils in coffee, and take with it the cafestol and carriol. So you're not getting the health benefits of those, and there's a lot of health benefits from them. So if you switch AeroPress to use a steel filter instead, you'll get all of those coming through.
I'll do that tomorrow.
So what's that? You change the filter.
Paper filter.
You take the paper filter out and you put a steel filter instead.
Yeah, you can buy them, and they're better for the environment as well because you can reuse them.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, I'll definitely implement that.
Yeah.
I'm sure it'll taste different too then, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's a bit more kind of akin. It's a bit closer to a cafetiere style flavor than the cleaner flavor of the paper.
Yeah, very interesting. Alex Manos, what's your preferred?
I have a steel sort of filter. So I had an AeroPress. I then went to is it the Chemex? I think it is. Yeah. So sort of that uses a paper filter basically as well. And now I have kind of more of a metal-based one after learning about this. And yeah, that's what I use every day. And as Alex says, there's the environmental element, which so makes you feel good for that reason as well. The one thing I'll add to kind of the whole diterpenes and the carriol and the cafestol is in the research, if someone can Google them for whatever reason, they'll find that they are the ones that also have been associated with an increase in like total cholesterol of coffee consumption. So some research and authors will say things like, if you already have elevated cholesterol or if you're at risk, etc., that maybe you want to use a paper filter to actually prevent these cholesterol increasing compounds from getting into the coffee. I think the caveat to that is they have other health benefits. So carriol has been associated with anti-cancer properties in like laboratory settings. They both have anti-inflammatory properties. And, you open up a can of worms around cholesterol, obviously, and its actual association with cardiovascular diseases. So there's a statistic that often goes around, something like around 15% of people who have, I think, a heart attack have normal cholesterol levels. So the idea that total cholesterol is a significant risk factor is kind of debated amongst practitioners and researchers anyway. So do we need to be as concerned as some of the research makes out around that? I guess there's, depending on who you ask, you'll get a different opinion.
One thing you've mentioned both in the reference to the steel filter is the environment. And I know Alex, I realize I'm saying Alex, but both of you called Alex. Alex Higham, you mentioned the environment being an important part of the steel thing, but also just in generally with the work that you're doing as well. Can you expand on your work with the environment and how the coffee and the consumption of coffee can affect the environment if it's not paid attention to?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, coffee is one of the most sprayed crops with pesticides in the world. It's apparently the third most sprayed crop, behind tobacco and cotton, neither of which you ingest. So the coffee industry is pretty bad for pesticides, although it is debated how much of that actually ends up in your final cup. But that said, we have only chosen coffee. So we only source our coffee from farms that use organic farming practices. Our current coffee is organic certified, but they don't necessarily have to be organic certified. We'll then test it ourselves for pesticides. So a lot of coffee producing plantations can't afford the certification themselves. So we said, we're not going to rule you guys out. But if you can guarantee that you are using organic practices, then we'll just test it ourselves as well. So kind of, first of all, only sourcing organically farmed coffee is going to be a lot better for the environment as well. And otherwise, I mean, as a business, I have a huge desire and passion to set up the business as sustainably as possible, right from benefiting the environment from the kind of organic side of things, but also making sure that all of our coffee is kind of fully traceable back to a named farm and a named farmer, which is kind of the trend in the specialty single origin type worlds, but really just making sure that it's fully traceable. Fair trade prices paid for everything, which is again common of specialty coffee. So we only source specialty coffee, which generally is it starts at around 5 to 10 times the fair trade price for coffee anyway. So kind of we're in the process. We're a pending B Corp at the minute, so we're kind of in the process of going through for full certification. So it's really important to me to set up the business in the right way.
Well, one thing that struck me is when I got the I think the packaging, but also the packet. It's you can put it in your food bin.
Yeah,
food waste bin. So that's unusual.
I spent a long time debating what the most sustainable type of packaging would be for the business, and you wouldn't believe how much I to and froed between recyclable plastic versus compostable materials. The kind of the age-old question, and everyone seems to stand on one side of the fence or the other. And at the end of all of my research, I came out on the side of compostable packaging. So all of our packaging is fully compostable. The pouch is made of PLA, including which is a plant-based cornstarch-based material. Including the valve, which is quite tricky to get as well. So it's all compostable. Anything that is paper is from FSC certified renewable sources of paper as well. We're fully plastic free as well. So there's no plastic anywhere in our packaging or anything. So there's not even the little, like the mailer boxes. I even found a company where the gum on the back of the mailer box has a little tiny red strip of plastic on it. So I even found a mailer that doesn't have that on it. So we've gone as far as we can with our packaging, basically.
Well, you clearly put a lot of work into that. Like, what was the trigger for you to think that deeply into how you're protecting the environment in what you are doing as a business?
I mean, it all boils down to me personally. I think my whole life is spent like that. I've spent over 5 years now traveling the world, just literally every corner of the world, and places, some kind of far-flung deserted islands in the world where you're kind of walking along paradise beaches in the furthest reaches of Indonesia, and they're full of plastic bottles, and you kind of, after a while, you kind of stop blaming the locals and realize that actually it's not their fault at all. It's kind of our problem it's our fault for introducing the problem of plastic in the first place. So it's up to us to kind of, lead the way in the world and try and find a solution to that. So it's seeing it firsthand, I think, is why.
Awesome. To wrap up, Alex, what's your vision for coffee? And tell us how your brand Exhale kind of fits into that vision.
So my vision for coffee is that coffee should be considered to have health benefits in the same league as fresh fruits and vegetables. So it should never replace fruits and vegetables, before anyone accuses me of saying that. It has health benefits in the same league, and most people think of it as a guilty treat still, which I really think is just so outdated, and the science is there, and to really help people visualize and to help support my argument. Our last test that we did, which was my favorite test of all, we sent a bag of our coffee down to a lab down in Plymouth, And we got Dr. Jan down there, gave her instructions on how to brew our coffee, sent her a bag of our coffee, bought her a cafetiere and a hand grinder, and she brewed a cup of our coffee with a cafetiere. And I sent her instructions to go to a local supermarket, and she bought a bag of 3 of the perceived healthiest foods in our diet. So she bought a bag of blueberries, kale, and oranges, and she tested the antioxidant power of our coffee, as well as blueberries, kale, and oranges. And she found that 1 cup of our coffee had the same antioxidant power, or the same antioxidant scavenging capacity as 12 punnets of blueberries, or 55 oranges, or 1.8 kilos of kale, all from 1 cup of our coffee. So obviously fruit and vegetables have a whole lot of other things in as well, but then so does coffee. You know, we also tested for niacin. It's one of the richest sources of niacin in your diet. But we just want to, my vision is that in 5 years' time, people think of coffee as akin to any other fruit or veg or superfood that might be in their diet.
Did you mean 1 cup brewed, or like 1 cup of dry?
1 brewed cup. So she brewed it in a cafetiere to our exact specifications. And in the blog section of our website, I've published the full lab report. It's a proper 20-page lab report that Dr. Jan from the lab down there did, and it's all there for everybody to read and dive into. And it's fully documented. She even wrote how many turns of the hand grinder she did to actually grind the coffee. So yeah, it's all there. 1 cup.
Awesome. And Alex Manos, what research needs to be done in order for Alex Wigham to fulfill this vision of his? What's missing?
It's a good question. I guess it's just trying to confirm some of these mechanisms and to continue with sort of the more randomized controlled studies, so we can get a better understanding and provide the level of evidence that some people obviously are always going to kind of demand ultimately. But it's there, it's growing. You know, we had someone reach out to us who wanted to kind of understand a bit more kind of the chlorogenic benefits in regards to brain health. And if you look at what's out there, there are numerous review studies. There are at least 5 randomized controlled clinical studies in humans. And then you've got all of this preclinical stuff as well. So it's kind of saying, and this is what all the authors in the research say, we just need more research now in humans, in clinical studies, to confirm the associations that we know are there so far. So it's kind of just continuing with the research that is now happening as a result of, as Alex said, that study in the BMJ in, I think it was 2017. So yeah, it's super exciting.
We also plan on doing a lot of studies ourselves into coffee. So we're still a new startup and it's still self-funded. I'm hoping to get some external round of investment in at some point, and as soon as I do, I will commit a good chunk of budget towards testing the coffee ourselves, to further understand how to extract the most of these healthy compounds out of coffee. So I can basically test the theories that we talked about earlier around grind size and water temperature, and go, right, here's an AeroPress, let's brew it 10 different ways and test each one of those. So we'll get a lot more data around that kind of thing, which will be really exciting, I think.
Any coffee geeks must be getting very excited about that. So Alex, where can people find out more about your coffee? Where can they grab themselves a bag and try it?
Yeah, so we only sell online on our website at the minute, which is www.exhalecoffee.com, and we're quite active on our Instagram, which is your exhale, and yeah, and that's where you can find us hanging out.
Awesome. Well, I've tried a batch. It's delicious. I'm looking forward to seeing you fulfill your vision. I think it's a great one. I think you can tell how passionate both of you are about coffee. I didn't think I'd ever spend an hour talking about coffee with someone. So thank you for your time, and appreciate it.
Amazing.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers.